Very informal kind of interview. Don't worry about checking out the camera or looking
All
at
right.
that. Just
Look
talk,
at you.
Just
All
talk
right.
to me.
All right.
And okay, terrific. Well, thanks for doing this. Gosh, it's good to see you again.
It's good to see you again.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about your early life growing up in Granite City, right?
Actually, I grew up in Edwardsville, Illinois. I was born in Granite City, so in those days, I was a resident there for probably 7 days.
Ah, okay.
And somehow I got translated to Granite City.
Okay, well, that's what I see in all the biographies.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
Well, growing up in Edwardsville, you really kind of grew up around where SIU Edwardsville was going to take root.
Yes, actually it was farmland on Route 157 at the time that I grew up. And when I left Edwardsville to go to Illinois State University, it was still farmland. And so, yes, it was beautiful farmland that I remember quite well.
Who were your early role models in life?
I would say, of course, my family, but as is probably true of a lot of kids from my background, it would be my teachers and my coaches. And I had a number of coaches that taught me some very important lessons.
How important was athletics in your early life? I know you were a standout basketball player.
Well, it was very important. Actually, by the time I liked baseball at the time, and I followed the St. Louis Browns. That's how far back I go. And by age 6, I was saving my money and buying the Sporting News so I could look at the batting averages. So I learned to read early, and then I learned how to compute batting averages very early. And I was always someone who liked to play sports, and so I did, and it was every minute of it was enjoyable. And it probably wasn't until I got to college that I realized that I had other things that I could do.
Well, along those lines, I understand that you were interested in sociology, psychology, and counseling. Right. What kind of drew you into that area?
I suspect it goes back to the original tests I had as a child that show that I had some of the interest tests that I took suggested that I might make a good policeman or minister or college administrator or teacher. And I think that kind of gravitated me to an area, plus role models that I had in high school in particular, that suggested that education was what I ought to be doing.
So you went to Illinois State for
right.
your bachelor's.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Who were some of your influences there?
Well, I was an athlete, so in those days at Illinois State you didn't get a full ride, and I had a nice job working in the Dean of Men's office. And so that was my first exposure to a telephone that had more than one line. And that was a real shock for me because where I grew up, we were on a party line. So Dick Hewlett was the Dean of Men, and he taught me how, his people taught me how to do this. And I stayed in that job for 4 years, and I ended up being the office manager. That was a big influence, as was the president of the university at the time, Robert G. Bone, who had this wonderful ability to remember names and faces, and something I never could acquire. I think it's not an acquired taste, but he was the kind that he would see you on campus. Not only would he call you by name, but he'd say, it looks as if something's bothering you. I mean, a tremendous amount of empathy. So that was a big influence, as were my sports activities. And by that time, I had learned that, indeed, I had a brain, and I could use it. And so I started making very good grades.
Did that sort of, that early exposure to the administrative life
yeah.
on campus, did that sort of set the tone for where you were going to go?
Well, I think it did. But when I graduated, I had a chance to teach in the suburban Chicago high school, and I did. But I think, yes, I think it probably set the stage for it. So I taught for 2 years, and then I went back to Illinois State, and through working at Urbana, I got my master's degree and then went on to Purdue. But I think, yes, I think it probably did set the stage for it.
One of the things I read about you said that you had something of an epiphany when you were student teaching while working on the master's degree. You came as sort of a surprise that not everybody had always a positive view of you.
Well, you did some good research there. I mean, I grew up with a very supportive family and a very supportive community, and I must say that Edwardsville, we went through integration of the schools while I was there, and it wasn't painless for anyone, but it was about as good as you could ever expect, and the tolerance was, for those days, was very high. And so I go through that experience, and it affected me greatly.
You were an assistant to the president at ISU early on.
Yeah.
And then you kind of took a chance to take an acting job as a vice president.
Yes,
for academic.
I did a lot of acting. I guess I didn't answer your earlier question. Pardon me.
Sure.
I just remembered that I didn't, but I don't remember what it was.
That was about student teaching.
Oh, yeah, I was actually teaching at the time, and I got waylaid because I felt very good about myself, and people seemed to like me. And so I get to teaching, and I realized that I was shocked to find out that if I didn't give good grades, that I wasn't liked. And it really helped me a great deal because I had to go through what that meant, and it really helped me in administration. And it didn't take me long to figure out that I had to do the right thing rather than to do the thing that made me liked, because the more you try to be liked with high school sophomores, the more they prey on you. And so it was a defining moment, as was moving from ISU, where I was assistant president, to Towson, which was the other part of your question. The risk that we took. I was the acting vice president for academic affairs at age 29. My good friend Jim Fisher had called to ask me to do it, and I said, well, Jim, what happens? I'm acting, and what's going to happen after? He says, I don't know what's going to happen after that. He said, but I'll find something for you. And so Mary Ann, we just had our third child, Sarah. So Sarah was 4 weeks old. When I came home, I said, Mary Ann, Jim called, and he wants me to come out and be acting vice president, and we don't know where it's headed, but there'll be something for me if I'm not picked. And she said, well, let's go. So we got in our little Ford Falcon with our 3 kids, with our little baby in the back in a laundry container, and went to Baltimore, Maryland. And so it jump-started my career about 15 years, because by age 30, I had competed for and I achieved the permanent job. And so by age 30, I was an academic affairs vice president instead of at age 45, which really leapfrogged me tremendously.
That is very early, because usually
yes.
people go through the whole academic career, assistant professor, so on and so
yes.
forth, full professor,
yeah.
and maybe dean. Yeah.
Yeah, and I never paid the academic dues, and at times it created difficulty, but not major difficulty, because actually my studies in psychology and sociology helped me understand the institutional culture very quickly.
That was a question I was going to ask, because there are very unique kinds of hierarchical
yes.
Institutions.
Yeah.
And, there's the old joke about the politics in higher ed are always so dirty because there's so little to fight over.
Yes, yeah.
What led you back to your hometown? This is what, 77?
Yeah, it was serendipity. I was 37 at the time. I had been at Towson for 9 years as academic affairs vice president. We loved living in Baltimore, and our kids loved it. And so somebody put me in for the Edwardsville presidency. It was called a presidency at the time. And so I said, oh, yeah, all right. And then I got a call, and they said, would you come for an interview? And I said, sure. And we actually had just come back from a vacation, taking the kids to New England, and so I had about 3 hours to prepare. And so I flew out, and I can see what was in the minds of the committee. This is kind of funny, Here we got this kid that went to Edwardsville High, and now we have a chance to see what he looks like. Let's just do it. What the heck? It only cost the price of a air flight, and actually I flew in and flew out on the same day, so it wasn't even an overnight. And so that's where it started. And so I did the interview, and then I got a call, and they said, you're one of the, I believe at the time it was 6, and would you come back for more extensive interviews? And why not? I had nothing to lose by this time, age 37, and so I did. And that was another kind of leapfrog, because at that age, I might not have gotten that first interview. And once I got the first interview, then it had to be up to me as opposed to never getting a chance to have the interview.
Now, Edwardsville as an institution was really very young.
Was very young.
A lot of things.
Very young.
I know it goes back to the extension programs
Yeah.
in the 40s.
Right.
But the campus was built in, what, 64?
I think that's about right. I think it was probably maybe when we got there 12 years old, and it had gone through a tremendous growth period. And I had the responsibility in the short time I was president to basically make it somewhat smaller. And we worked very hard at that. And the idea was we had to deal with how fast we could grow and the quality of the student body. And I'm really delighted that the CEOs, Lazarson, Werner, and others since then have really kind of put their mark on the place and made it a true regional institution.
When you became chancellor, which was the system title,
at the time,
a few years ago, SIU was coming off of a real time of crisis. Dwight Morris had been there for so many years, and then you had a succession of interim leaders and the like. And SIU was a system with two campuses, a medical school campus coming online. That was a big challenge.
I tell you what made it a big challenge, and it continues, I think, to be a challenge. The SIU system is too large to just, in effect, well, let's put it this way, it's too small to be a system as you might think of a system in California. But it's really too large to allow it to just kind of flounder. And so the challenge was to find a way that gave the campuses continued to have the autonomy that they needed to achieve what was important to their regions and to their mission, but at the same time to have some coordination. And that was a bigger challenge than all the other, the worries about the past and things that had kind of caused a drift. And so I took it upon myself. And I wasn't actually, I was a reluctant candidate because I loved being president of a campus and didn't get to do it again until I was in Syracuse. So, I saw it as a challenge to put it together in a way that the campuses could maintain their identities rather than one big SIU.
And it was also tough because I remember I came to SIU professionally in '81.
Yeah.
And then those early years, we had a series of economic setbacks at the state level and the national level, and so you had all these different programs out there, and they were actually talking about some consolidation.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
How do you do that? It's tough.
Yeah, well, it was tough, and it's been sort of a part of my experience, and did some of the same in Wisconsin, and quite a bit of cutting back in Syracuse. I got better at it as I went along.
When you went to the University of Wisconsin,
yes.
That too was in its own way. That was a fairly young system, as I recall.
Yes.
It only dates back to '71 when the state universities and the University of Wisconsin were merged. Mm-hmm. Talk about that set of challenges.
Well, it was a challenge in the sense that it was at the time it was 157,000 students, and they still have 13 four-year campuses and 13 two-year, and so it all came together. The challenge there again was to provide the institutions with enough autonomy, particularly Madison, which is a flagship internationally reputable institution, to provide it with the flexibility it needed, at the same time to bring it all together. And what I tried to do there was to bring it together, particularly in terms of its ability to interface with the public and with government. And so the big challenge there was to make all of that work and keep people more or less on the team, but nevertheless having their own piece that they were going to do. And that piece at one campus would be a little different than another piece, and we'd all be happy about that, with Madison sort of hovering over with all of its grants and foundation money.
And it was uniquely positioned, too, being in the state capital. So
it was, which is where we lived, and so everything that you did and didn't do was subject to 2 local papers and at the time 2 Milwaukee papers. So 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon. And so, for example, if there was a tuition increase, and it was announced at 10 o'clock in the morning. It was in the afternoon papers, so the morning papers were angry. And so then their thing would be not to repeat it, but then to interview students who were unhappy with the tuition increase, and in the afternoon would have to do something, and any kind of issue would go for about 3 weeks.
I know the cycle well.
Yes,
You're exactly
yeah,
right.
It's fun.
With that, one of the things that I remembered from your being here was you're always very approachable. You're always, you answer the phone, buzzsaw, what's going on, How did that, your personality fit that very public, and sometimes it's a controversial role?
I think it fit very well, which is, I'm not a person that can do things that are not by their nature easy to do. And so I've never been someone that tries to deceive people. What you see is what I am. Obviously, your public persona is always a little bit different, is always a little more formal, but I've tried to be myself, and that's the only way I can be happy with what I'm doing. So it wasn't as difficult as I might have imagined. Now, I'm not necessarily a social butterfly, and so you'd say, well, how are you going to traverse that? Well, what I found very early is if you're in a position of formal leadership, it's taken care of for you. You don't have to walk around and shake hands. You kind of enter the room and people come to you. And so I didn't find it that difficult, frankly. Taxing, tiring, but not stressful.
You had a good run at the University of Wisconsin.
Had a great run at Wisconsin.
And 1991, Syracuse University. That was a university that had a terrific heritage,
yes,
great traditions, very strong programs and the like, but it had huge problems.
Yes.
I read a $38 million deficit.
There was a huge projected deficit over 5 years, and they had done very good planning, so it wasn't as if we had to cut it right away, but it was very clear what had to be done over time, and it wasn't clear to me when I took the job, but it was soon after that. And it was a very enjoyable challenge, I must say. And part of the reason it was enjoyable is I could bring to bear all I learned in the other two positions, major positions that I was in. But what we basically did there is I started from the assumption that transparency, it was time for transparency to exist in a private institution. And so we had, everything was open. And there were people that thought that the endowment had so much money that this wasn't a problem. There were people that thought we were going broke. And neither was true. And so we basically showed what our assets were. We showed what our endowment, we had in our endowment and what we had in special accounts. And we showed by program how we were doing. And so my theme was, if you look at where our money comes from, if you count the auxiliaries plus tuition, it's about 80% undergraduate tuition. So let's be sure we're focusing on where our money comes from. And it's not that we are not a major research institution, but let's be sure we know who we are. And so that was the backdrop to dealing with the issue. And we developed a 3-year plan within 6 months that started this. And we spent money because the university was not poor. It was just it had to change its ways. We spent a lot of money. We spent money on institutional improvement. We spent money on faculty early retirements, and it all worked. And so it's nice to have something in your career that really worked.
There were some tough choices, though.
Tough choices.
I understand something like 600 jobs were eventually.
Yes, we had 135 faculty that took early retirement. They were tenured. And we made that money back in about 3 years because, in other words, we gave them very generous buyouts. And they then, of course, wherever they wanted to go, many of them were in their late 50s, so they had lots of juice left. And so we had less in our operating budget. We had a smaller operating budget, so we made it back in about 3 years. So we had that, and then we had a lot of our staff that we had to reduce in force. But we developed a program where we helped them find other jobs, and then they became the first to be picked when jobs opened up. And yes, it was difficult, but the campus kind of rallied behind it because they realized that over time we had to deal with this.
One of the temptations when you're in a situation like that, though, is to try, as you said, 80% of the funding came from undergraduate tuition. One of the temptations is to lower your standards to pull more people in.
Yeah. I tell you what, that was not a temptation. And the reason it wasn't is, first of all, I don't believe in that. But secondly, at a private institution, the last you want to be seen as is a school that has low standards when you're charging the kind of tuition that's being charged. And so the faculty immediately gravitated to, I forgot to say, the other thing we had to do is we cut our undergraduate enrollment by, I think, about 1,600 students over the 3-year period. And so that was a part of corresponding cut in faculty staff complement and then the cut in the student body. And so that was all a part of, in effect, raising standards, being somewhat smaller, not a lot smaller, but somewhat smaller and better. And then being the student-centered research university, which was our main focus.
Would you say that was the stamp you left on the...
Yes. And I tell you, the first year, I can remember when I knew it had taken, we were having a summer program for deans and department chairs. And so in the middle of what I was trying to do with the group and they with me, one of the deans stood up and said, "I'm sorry, but I don't want to appear rude, but I have to get up. I have a 11 a.m. phone call to make to one of our accepted students to start the counseling process." Okay. In those days, that was not something that was done a lot of, but every one of the students who had been accepted were being called by deans and department chair and faculty, and that was of their volition. That wasn't a part. We had about a 25-point program that we were doing, and that wasn't one of the points. It just was a part of a spirit of being more student-centered. That's when I knew it was going to take.
It's good advice. We're doing more and more of that
Sure.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
When you retired, what do you think your greatest accomplishment was at Syracuse?
Oh, I would say definitely it was going through the restructuring, but in effect, remaking ourselves into a student research university. Now that term is not used at Syracuse anymore, and understandably, it's new leadership. But I think the concept is going to continue, and I think Syracuse now knows itself better, what it can and can't do, and they're the better for it, and I was the better for the experience.
You've written, you've been very active in retirement. I wouldn't even call it retirement.
No, I wouldn't either. Yeah, yeah.
You've written 2 books on leadership. You've written numerous articles on that. What have you gleaned from your experience as a higher educational administrator? What are the qualities of a good leader?
Well, I think about it a lot, and I always thought about it, and of course my studies helped a lot, my graduate studies, but I think about it more now because I'm teaching leadership to graduate students and to business seniors, and so it occupies a lot of my thought rather than the day-to-day things that my leadership jobs required. I would start with number 1, and I'm often asked this, what's most important? And I would say self-awareness. That if you have a leader that doesn't know himself or herself, strengths, weaknesses, likes, dislikes, the person cannot form a team. They cannot deal with problems because they're unwilling to look at whether or not they are causing the problem. So I would say self-awareness is the first of several. Integrity is the second. International studies even show you could have all kinds of differences of opinion about what leaders should be like. Number 1 is integrity, trust. We want to trust you to do what's right for the institution. We want to believe in what you say, and we want to trust that you're competent. And so once you get beyond integrity, trust, being self-aware, emotionally intelligent, you get into skill sets that have to be different for the situation. But then you're probably starting with an understanding of what the institutional environment is like.
How would you define intentional leadership?
Intentional leadership is you may stumble into it, but you lead. And you lead from where you are. You may be a leader who's been given the position. You may be a formal leader. You may be somebody that hasn't been given the position. you're an informal leader that maybe, as we looked at the hurricane in New Orleans, much of the leadership did not come from government, as we now know, but from a lot of people doing things, stepping up. And so it's intentional, and it's not necessarily always given to you, but you step up and you do it.
I want to talk about a couple of other trends
Sure.
because of your insight. You know, one of the problems that right now Illinois is facing, and I'm sure it's true in a lot of other places, but you know, the state support for higher education continues on a downward path, and we're looking more to our students. We're looking more
Yes.
grant and contract activity. How do we continue to keep higher education accessible and affordable, given the current set of dynamics we have?
It's going to be very difficult, in my opinion. And the reason it's going to be difficult is that here we're in the beginnings or in the middle of a recession, however you want to define it. But beyond that, if you look at the cost for Medicaid, Medicare, and some of the other costs to government and public education, and none of us are going to argue that these are bad expenditures, it's going to be very difficult for higher ed to maintain what it has. And so then, to me, the biggest thing that states in particular can do, in New York City, our New York State has just gone through a major study of what the state institutions ought to be like, and there's all kinds of expenditures, which won't happen, by the way, at least for the foreseeable future. But then there's a piece about giving the institutions greater flexibility. And people have said, well, what do you think about all this? And my comment is, the money may not be there. To me, the acid test is, will they give the institutions the flexibility? For example, can SIUC have the flexibility to raise tuition beyond what might be politically feasible, but then to give grants to the needy? That's what private schools do. I mean, private schools will discount tuition by about 30-35%. That money goes to the needy, and the more wealthy have to pay the full freight. What you find is that the political interference comes less from those that need it and those who are in upper middle income situations that have one fine deal going to a state institution. And so if the states really want to help institutions of higher education, yes, they'll fund them, but number two, they'll give them the flexibility to manage the resources they have and understand that they expect accountability and outcomes measurement, but they don't get into the details and tell how much tuition there should be. You can't kill this program because there's too much political interference. You can't have it both ways.
One of the things that we're trying to do right now, Glenn Pichard is working with former Speaker Hastert to try to gin up support for a capital bill. We've gone 9 years without one.
Yeah.
And one of the things Glenn points to is a study not too far back about how many universities are being built in China and India, and how the United States is in danger of losing its competitive edge. How do we focus on this as a national issue, as a national strategy?
Well, it's not easy because we have a very short attention span in this country, and we become interested when we see a crisis. That's part of a democracy, and so we're not at the crisis level yet. I would say that it's easier for states to give capital money than it is operating, and that there are states that are more than happy to give you a building, particularly if you name it after an area legislator, and because it's bonded over a long period of time, so the payment isn't so great. The real catch is how many, will they allow you to, for example, reduce some of your enrollment to preserve quality, to raise tuition, to give more to the needy, to have programs for those who need extra programs, summer experiences, to have better transfer programs, to experiment and to do these things. To me, that's going to be the future. And Glenn is absolutely right that our competitors are moving forward. Our competitors also have people coming out of their schools, the high schools, that are much better qualified. Now, is it because a lower percentage are going on to higher ed? I think that's part of it. But also part of it is that in a lot of situations we're not expecting enough of our high school kids, and most of whom work now. And so we need to be sure that students understand that the work of a 16-year-old is being a student. And if they want a job at Walmart, fine, but let's be sure they're doing the work of a student.
Well, we were lucky in that respect. My stepdaughter was able to go all the way. She went from start to finish in 4 years. She's graduating next weekend. We didn't make her work in high school.
Yeah.
And I think it helped.
I suspect so. No, there's the other side is that students need a work experience. I think that's nice, but working 4 years at Walmart is probably 3 years more than you need to have that kind of work experience. And if anything, if you have to work somewhere else and work different places and learn different things. My guess is that your daughter was a minority in that instance. Most of the kids going to college now are working because they have to.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A couple of questions to wrap up, of course. You've had a terrific partner in this whole enterprise.
Yes.
With Mary.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I'll start with when we had our first child, and she was having a very, very difficult time birthing. And so it was like 26 hours, as I recall. And so I was with her the whole time, of course. And it was a young marriage. And so the nurse came in. She said, I can see that you love each other, but you also really like each other. And it was true. And so we've always really liked each other. And she has been supportive of my risk-taking. And I've been supportive of her development. She has a master's degree in reading. She's been a vice president of a United Way. She's run her own reading business. She's now doing consulting with not-for-profits. And so it's been a kind of team effort, which has been just phenomenal, sort of with the icing on the cake being at Syracuse, where she, in effect, worked for me and the university, and was extremely helpful and supportive. So it's been wonderful, continues to be wonderful.
As you look back, and you're not done yet.
I'm not done yet.
As you look back, though, on your career in public and private higher education, what gives you the most personal satisfaction out of what you've done?
I think probably I try to keep score, and so I look at SIU and my time here at Edwardsville. I think the very fact that they're sticking to their mission. I think for the overall system, that I was able to bring some rationality to the way it was governed, giving the campus its freedom. At Wisconsin, it was attempting to deal with the fact that it's an underfunded situation and trying to deal with what I was referred to as the Shaw Triangle, tuition, enrollment, and aid, institutional aid from the state, and trying to balance those off, trying to leave that message and trying to be stronger with government. And at Syracuse, of course, it was the Student-Centered Research University as the way of pushing for our financial reforms that we had to make. Putting it all together, I guess the thing that makes me happiest is that people in Southern Illinois would recognize that I must have done something right, and at Wisconsin and at Syracuse. And we have lots of very good friends.
Wonderfully said. One final question, and it's, what is it like to receive the Lincoln Award?
Well, it's a wonderful feeling. It's an unexpected award. And when you see all the people that have gotten it and the achievements they've had, I'm very humbled by it. And I'm looking forward to this evening. And I probably won't wear my sash much, but that's okay. I'll try it out a few times. But it's just a wonderful thing to be included with this caliber of people.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I think so.
Let's make sure that we have it committed to
yes.
DISC.
Memorialize it.
Well, when I saw your name on the